Good morning, beautiful people. Welcome to another episode of Kiko's Free Thinkers Forum. This is episode 92, and I'm your host and creator of Kiko's Free Thinkers Forum, Kiko. I'm going to be the guest as well today. And this is a special episode 92 because we're going to be talking about a future book of mine that is going to be built from my dissertation. This is going to cover my third chapter from my dissertation, which deals with Brazil, and a novel especially entitled Sortilegio Dois, which translates roughly into Sorcery 2, and it has a subtitle, The Return of Zumbi, Zumbi dos Palmares. We'll talk about Zumbi later in the episode, but I just want to say thanks to all my viewers and listeners. You all know that we're now exclusively a YouTube channel. And if you're on Spotify or any of the old audio platforms, we have not updated that information yet as far as letting people know that this is exclusively a YouTube channel. I think some of the last episodes I did on the audio platforms, I told people that we would be making the transition, but I'm not sure that everyone that has been following me on Spotify within this last 18, 19 months has actually made the transition. So I encourage all my friends and family to please subscribe to Kiko's Free Thinkers Forum official YouTube channel. I think there's a little bit there for everyone. We really appreciate this. This supports independent media, and we have to support independent media because a lot of the stuff that you get from the mainstream media is not going to talk about these types of cultural issues, political issues in depth, and they're not going to be presented in a non-argumentative way. They're going to always be presented in this dual, this fight between two sides or whatever, this whole dynamic. So we try to avoid this stuff on Kiko's Free Thinkers Forum. We try to look into the nuance of things, analyze things, bring on different perspectives. We don't like to put people in boxes. And that's again, free thinker. You're supposed to be open minded. I mean, generally speaking. But that's what we try to do here at the forum. I don't expect you all to agree with everything I say, a lot of what my guests say, but again, we appreciate your attention. We've grown a lot. I want to grow even more. The goal is to hit 20,000 subscribers by the end of the year 2024. I believe that we can do it. If it doesn't happen, it's totally fine. But we want to just encourage that. Please subscribe for free. It doesn't cost you a dime. You're not going to see me asking you for money on this forum. Just simply subscribe for free if you find the content interesting, because we all know if this was a TikTok video or any other Instagram, whatever it may be, you're more likely to click like something that quickly. So give independent creators like myself a chance, to really grow, because you're not going to find this content again anywhere else. I mean, I want to urge that, and share these videos with your friends and family. Don't be ashamed. Don't be scared. But let's go to the episode 92. Sorry about the long ad. I didn't want it to be too long. And also my international community, 44% um, outside of the United States, my viewership. And so this shows the forum really growing, and just the versatility and the diversity within the viewership in general. But going back to episode 92, we have a lot to talk about today. Brazil, the racial democracy myth, Candomblé, the Afro cosmology systems that I made a brief mention to earlier, and Sortilegio Dois. We have a lot to cover here. I'm going to try to get this done in an hour 15 minutes, because I know you all have places to go, and I do too. So I'm going to give you all a historical framework. I just have a few notes here prepared just so I have some bullet points to go by. But this is off kind of the hip. And so follow with me, take notes if you need to. Don't expect this to be too formal. I will show some visuals so you all have an idea of PowerPoint presentation, just like a visual presentation, and just some pictures. I want you all to kind of drive the point I'm making today. Historical framework. So my chapter 3 debunks the racial democracy myth. It's still a thing, unfortunately. And so I'm going to try to briefly tell this to people who may not be accustomed to Brazil, this whole idea of a racial democracy. But generally speaking, the racial democracy comes from the idea that Brazil is a very diverse country racially, which there is a lot of racial diversity in Brazil. I don't want to deny that, the cultural, the racial diversity, everything else, geographic. But this is the whole idea that people are so harmonious in Brazil that racism is like at a minimal compared to other places. I mean, this has always been a big thing in Brazil. Um, and it's a way for the country to be exploited, honestly, because this goes into the tourism industry. Um, People like to sell certain images to different places, and Brazil is victim of this, and also a perpetuator as well. The United States, all these countries do this to give the idea of inclusiveness, of harmony, equilibrium, everything else. But the reality is that if you analyze Brazil some and look deeper into the superficial images, you realize that it's not a racial democracy whatsoever. First of all, you have to define what's the democracy. I think this is an idealistic view, but the racial democracy myth basically goes behind the idea that we're so culturally diverse, racially diverse, that racism is going to be at a minimum based on that alone. And then you have white Brazilians um, alluding to like distant black ancestry to kind of include themselves within the African family, because this goes back to Gilberto Freire. He popularized this term racial democracy. He never actually used it in his studies, I don't think. He used social democracy. And Gilberto Freire was an anthropologist. He was really known in 1933 when he published an anthropological piece called um, Casa Grande e Senzala, the big house and the slave quarters, which was a study um, that talks about Brazilian society and how there's this family of basically you have the Portuguese family and the African family together, living together as a whole Brazilian community. And you can include Amerindian, indigenous people as well, the original inhabitants of the Americas, Black people, the white Portuguese people, the Dutch people that were in Brazil, and the slaves that were imported into Brazil. So you have that mixture there. And that's kind of what it talks about. It makes the argument that even the white people are tropical. They have this special unity with the African community. This is all in this anthropological piece, Casa Grande Senzala, published in 1933. We have to keep in mind that when Freire wrote this stuff, um, white supremacy. I mean, that's the only way I can really put white supremacy, and also scientific racism, eugenics. A lot of these ideas were popular, and especially between the two World War periods, 1916 and 1945. And this is a part of the history of the Americas that people like to ignore in the United States. Um, I like to refer to the Buck versus Bell case, 1927, where the government basically made it legal to sterilize people who were viewed as unfit, um, people who were viewed with disabilities. They linked that to genetics. They linked that to people's IQs. And Carrie Buck was a person that was victim of this, sterilized against her will, and some people were euthanized. I mean, because they were viewed as unfit in society. And this all goes into this eugenics movement. The eugenics movement was huge in the world during this time period between the two the world wars. And in Brazil, this was no exception. So this is debunking the racial democracy myth. And I know this sounds extensive, but it has to be extensive because I know Brazil is kind of the focal point, but it's more than just Brazil. And so the racial democracy myth from Gilberto Freire, from this anthropological piece, that's when it really popularized, but the ideas were already there from Auguste Comte, from the 19th century with positivism, and then the scientific Darwinism stuff that came out, Herbert Spencer, all this stuff came out in the 19th century. So you have this divergence, convergence of ideas surrounding this whole idea of the inferior races, the superior races. This is very common during this period in 1933 that we're talking about. Cuba, it didn't matter where you were, there was some kind of a myth involved when it came to this racial democracy myth. It's not just exclusive to Brazil, also Cuba, um, to a lesser extent the United States. But we see these types of games being played, and I'm going to make that point later. That gives you a little bit of history of where the myth comes from, the racial democracy myth. Um, and debunking it is pretty easy, as you will see later on into this analysis. So my chapter basically attacks that, the whole idea of a racial democracy using Sortilegio Dois, which is a theater piece that was written by a gentleman. His name was Abdias do Nascimento. And he lived, I think he was around 100 years old when he died. He died, I think, back in 2011. And he founded a Black experimental theater in Brazil in the 40s, I think, when people weren't allowing Black people really in the mainstream to be in theater or film or anything like that. And so the whole idea of sortilegio, the first one was actually written in 1951, I believe, but it wasn't published in 1957 because of censorship. But remember, this is the racial democracy, Brazil, the harmonious races living together, the Amerindians, the Black people, the white people. But you realize that is not as it seems on the surface with this racial democracy situation going on. So chapter 3, Sortilegio Dois, attacks that. The first Sortilegio, again, that was written in 51, censored for 6 years, published in 57. And then the second Sortilegio was written in 1979. It added different elements from the original, and that was written in 51, published in 57. And Abdias do Nascimento led a philosophy named quilombismo. Quilombismo coming from the word quilombo, which is the base for a settlement, basically where Blacks escaped slavery and colonization. And we're talking like the 1500s. And so they were escaped. They would go to these like distant areas, jungles, mountains, wherever it was, just distant away from, the European enslavers, the colonizers. And sometimes there would be whites living in these communities with the Blacks, and sometimes indigenous people, but these were predominantly Black communities. They were called quilombos, these settlements. And you still have quilombos today in Brazil. The most popular one being Quilombo dos Palmares, um, which is located in the northeast of Brazil, because that's where pretty much the heart of Black culture is in Brazil. Don't want to. That's a far-reaching comment. There's Black culture all over the country, but especially in the northeast. And you have the Quilombo dynamic there, and that's also talked about in Sortilegio Dois. Before we get into the actual literary analysis, which may go over some people's heads, again, I think it's important to layer the paint accordingly for people who may not understand, what we're talking about. Let's pull up Brazil on a map, for instance. I'm going to share a screen for you just so we have this information. And let's go to Let's just see a map. Let's look at a world map and see Brazil in relation to Africa. Notice how Brazil is so far to the east of the United States, for instance. And maps aren't drawn to scale, so you really can't tell how big areas are. I mean, look at Alaska. Alaska is technically the largest state, um, but it's so big that the map doesn't really capture how big, Alaska is. But these maps aren't drawn to scale, but it gives you an idea. Brazil is pretty close to Africa. If you look at that, like generally speaking, just look at the map. Brazil is in close proximity to Africa. And so when we talk about the transatlantic slave trade, especially, it makes sense that when this was happening, geographically, I mean, Brazil is the closest location in the Americas, and South America is right here. So we can see where the concentration during the transatlantic slave trade, Senegal, Guinea-Bissau, Sierra Leone, Ghana, all these areas right here, Togo, Nigeria. You can see the proximity right here and the route that they would take. And this area here, the Northeast, that's where a lot of the slaves were brought in. Now, of course, we had slaves brought in all throughout the Caribbean, the United States. But this is the interesting fact. Only around 6% of Black people who were brought against our will in Africa during the transatlantic slave trade, 6% in the United States, roughly more or less. So 94%, guess where those people were brought? All over Latin America, South America, Brazil, taking in a lot of those people, the Dominican Republic, Cuba, Haiti. So you kind of see what I'm getting at. Latin America, when we talk about Blacks and the transatlantic slave trade, 94% to Latin America, which includes Mexico, the Caribbean, South America, Central America, like all these places, Argentina, even Uruguay. Um, Uruguay still has, to a greater extent than Argentina, a Black presence, Afro, um, Latin presence. But this gives you an idea why Brazil is so important when we talk about Blackness in Latin America and this whole idea of the transatlantic slave trade, which we hear about all the time in school. We're taught about it all the time. But this area right here, the northeast of Brazil, Salvador being the capital of Bahia, Bahia is the state that has the largest concentration of Black people. And that's where you have a lot of the heart of Black culture. And this is kind of where, and I'm going to share another screen. This is where the myth is really expanded upon. If we go to an artist that's from the northeast of Brazil, for instance, Daniela Mercury, she's right here. But see, this is an up-to-date picture of Daniela Mercury right here. This is an up-to-date picture of her, more or less, compared to some of the other pictures I'm going to show you. So this is how she looks now. Daniela Mercury, she's an axé pop singer in Brazil, very popular. La música popular brasileira, Brazilian popular music. If you follow music in Brazil, you probably heard a Daniela Mercury song without realizing it. She's been around since, honestly, the 80s, because she was in a band called Companhia Click, but she went solo in 92. I got a lot of her albums. Her debut album dropped in 92. And it was self-entitled Daniela Mercury, or Daniela maybe. And she really exploded with her second album, O Canto da Cidade, the chant of the city, or the song of the city. That was where she really popularized the genre called Axé, AXE with an accent over the E, which is also a term that comes from Yoruba culture, the Yoruba tradition, And we're going to have a Baba, a priest, come on next week, Awo, who I know personally, and we're going to talk all about Ifa, which is the the cosmological, the spiritual system from the Yoruba culture, which is largely associated with the transatlantic slave trade. That's what um, our culture had when we were forced against our will into this new world that we know as the United States, Brazil, Costa Rica, Cuba, all these different places. And it's a belief, it's a traditional spiritual system. It predates these major religions that we talk about all the time, Ifa, and it comes from Nigeria, and that's a lot to do with the spirituality component that I talk about in the third chapter of my dissertation, which is the Brazil chapter that we're talking about here. And I know I'm going all over the place because I was just talking about the transatlantic slave trade, but remember I'm doing this kind of off the fly. Um, so yeah, we will talk about that more with Baba Awo next week. That should be a very interesting conversation. I really encourage people to follow that particular episode. But going back to the myth, Daniela Mercury, this popular Brazilian singer, I showed you a more update picture of her. Now I'm going to show you the game. This is what we talk about when we discuss the myth at hand. This is Feijão com Arroz, her album, Rice with Beans, Beans with Rice. Notice how the contrast you have here. This is Daniela Mercury, and this is a visual artist that's with her. And this is a woman too, which you can't tell just looking at the back right here. But notice the contrast. So you look at her and you're like, okay, she's quote unquote Brazilian, which we conflate a lot of times race with nationality. To me, she looks morena clara or pretty much white. Even in Brazil, I mean, she would be considered white. Here in the United States, we have just this perception of people. We make Hispanic a race when it's not. It's simply an ethnicity because you can be black and Hispanic, Asian and Hispanic, white and Hispanic, indigenous and Hispanic. But the way people are in the United States, we lump everything together. Um, it's very minimalistic. It's very dumbed down. That's the way things are done here, though. You know, we have the one drop rule, which probably has a lot to do with that. And so we just put people in these categories. If you look any way black whatsoever, you're considered black. This was enforced through the courts. This has a historical precedent in the United States. Brazil, not so much, but I believe that the one drop rule is also influencing Brazil more and more. So you have this visibly, again, in the United States, maybe she looks more ambiguous. To me, she looks white. In Brazil, she's white. Anywhere she's white, but she's from Salvador, Bahia. Salvador, the city, Bahia being the state in Brazil in the Northeast that has this high concentration of blacks. And so people in that area are normally going to gravitate towards black culture, African culture, because that's, you know, the heart of the culture, especially in Brazil, comparing even within the country. This is where you have a big carnival. We think Mardi Gras is big in New Orleans, but the one in Brazil, the ones down there are way bigger. Even some of the ones in Latin America are bigger than the one in Mardi Gras. But you really see Black culture on display during those events, especially too. But you see the visual game here, this racial democracy stuff. Um, this is just one picture. I'm going to show you a few more. See what I mean? Notice the use of another black person because again, she's selling to people that she's black. I think she's went on the record a couple of times and she took a lot of flack for it, basically identifying as a black person. She would have the different hairstyles. But you see here, again, this is the image that's been sold. And this is through music. I mean, she's a musician, she's an artist, but still, when you see these images, something's been sold to you, and this association with blackness, you have a person that from the outside they're like, okay, well, she's probably black too, because I mean, look at the other person, they're black, so of course she's black too, right? She's just lighter skin. And that's the game display, because again, I showed you the original picture, and I don't want to make this all about race, but I'm just making a point. There's a game been played. I mean, she has naturally curly hair, and she probably has some black ancestry, but I have white ancestry. I have almost 20% white ancestry, but I don't identify as white. But you have people in Brazil who are like 15% black in their DNA, which isn't the only component of a person. When you talk about like what race is, which is actually a social construction, it's societally based, but it comes from something, the whole idea of race. But these people are identifying as black in some cases, even though they have like 15% ancestry and the rest is European. They may have some American Indian ancestry. But you see the gameplay, because look at this image versus that image. And then you also go to this one right here. The tribal sort of dynamic that's being used in the image right here. Solda Libertagia, I think is the name of this album cover right here. Let's see if there's another one I can get. Again, notice the inclusion of the different cultural dynamics in Brazil. When you talk about race, there's always a black person. If you look at all of her covers, look at the transformation of Daniela Mercury over the years. And yes, I'm using her as an example because this is the perpetuation of the racial democracy myth. You're seeing it right here visually. You have this man right here, clearly a black person in Brazil. And then you have this woman here who could be a Mary Indian, and also she may have some black ancestry. But that's common in Brazil. Even the white people in Brazil have visibly black ancestry, but that doesn't make everyone black just because they have some black ancestry. But this is very confusing to Americans. And people in Brazil who perpetuate the myth understand that this is confusing to people who aren't accustomed to discussing race and this discourse around race. And so they use this to project these images. They put them in the brochures. Look at Brazil. Look at all these people. We get along so well. Look, even the whites are so understanding of black culture. Even the whites are black. And so it gives you a bunch of confusing signals. And you may say at first, like, okay, what's wrong with that? Embracing diversity, quote unquote. But when it's not unfair situations and they're very imbalanced situations like police brutality, which is what's really highlighted in the theater piece, Sortilégio Dois, you understand that it's not simply everyone getting along. There's a lot of tension that's in society, not so much harmony, but more so tension. And I'm trying to think if there's anything else with Daniela Mercury. I think that's it with her. But then you have another person projecting the myth, Adriana Lima. She's the Victoria's Secret model, very popular. You all probably know who she is. Adriana Lima. She's from Salvador, which is like a heart of black culture in Brazil, the capital of Bahia state, in the northeast of Brazil. So, blue eyes. She has, tan skin, like naturally she does. But she identifies as Afro-Brazilian. Um, she has for a long time. I mean, ever since I've known anything about Adriana Lima, she's always identified as Afro-Brazilian. She says it in her interviews and stuff. Um, I'm going to show you another. This is a more up-to-date picture of her right here, Adriana Lima. You see it right here. I mean, is she black? I mean, you be the judge. But I mean, this is what I mean in Brazil. This is how race is also configured, and then you have this thing called the IBEG, I believe, and it's a census. It's a census. It's the name of the census in Brazil. I believe it's the IBEG, and I think at one point, I don't know how much it's changed because I did a big presentation on. There's like 113 different categories on race that you can classify yourself. I mean, Firedor, which is like a mirror Indian, black ancestry, white ancestry. So basically mixed race. And that's the tendency in Brazil. Most people identify as multiracial mixed race because there is a lot of racial um, dynamic in Brazil. I'm not going to deny that, but it's also being exploited at the same time. And then you have the black category, negro, which a lot of times people who or black won't even identify as black. They will identify as pardo, or they will identify as white in some cases. Like this, like people darker than me in Brazil sometimes identify as white. But that's the way the classification system is when people are identifying on the census and stuff. There's a tendency to de-emphasize black ancestry. Cuba, this happens a lot. In Colombia, this happens a lot. But Colombia, for instance, has one of the highest black populations in Spanish speaking Latin America. I think it's like a fifth of the population in Colombia is black. 21%, I believe, 21, 22%, I want to say. And people don't think about this stuff. In Cuba, their estimates that easily 60 to 65% of the population is black. But like I said, how do you determine what black is and who's recording the data, who's writing this stuff down, who's self-identifying this way. So the official government statistics may be 15% black or 20% black, when in reality it's 65%. Puerto Rico, this happens a lot. There's a de-emphasis on the census of blackness. There's a deliberate attempt to minimize blackness in the statistical data and really invisibilize it in general. Like even though it's very prevalent in the popular culture, music, and everything else, it's reflected in cuisine. And so Brazil's no exception. I mean, this all goes into the myth where you see a picture of Adriana Lima, and I'm going to show a younger picture of her because I mean she does have some black ancestry for sure. You can tell. Um, More so. Let me close these out here. She has it more so. A younger picture of her, Adriana Jove. So you can see here that she looks more multiracial, more biracial for sure. Um, but it gives you an idea of what I'm talking about, this selling of images. And one more thing before we um, go a little bit more to the textual analysis of the racial democracy myth. This is important because when the World Cup happened in Brazil in 2014, Brazil hosted the World Cup in 2014, I believe. Um, Favelas in Brazil, which are settlements, they're not neighborhoods. They're designated as such as favelas. And I don't like to use the term slum, but that's a term that people are familiar with. There's a visual associated with slum. But favelas in Brazil are very common. They're on the hillsides a lot of times. Even though that's not always the case in Sao Paulo, favelas sometimes are even underground or lower, as opposed to some of the favelas in Rio de Janeiro, which are on hilltops and on mountaintops. But what do I mean when I say the racial democracy myth in popular culture? This is what I mean. Favelas during the 2014 World Cup, there was a deliberate effort for tourists when they came to Brazil. They were actually the government, the Brazilian government, they paid Google. I don't know if they actually did it or not, Google, because I should have looked into this before I did the interview right now. But anyway, before I did the presentation today, let me stop screen sharing for a second. I don't know if you all want to see me or not, but basically they um they tried to bait Google into hiding these favelas, these slums in Brazil. Um, because in these favelas, it's highly um they're dominated by darker people. A lot of times black people, but there are white people that live in favelas too. I know people that live in the favelas in Brazil. Um, and it's all over the place. It represents a different level of poverty. But like I said, favela is a unique thing to Brazil. You have terms that are called favelas in other places in Latin America, other places of the world, villas, miserias in Argentina. But it's a gradient of poverty. Poverty has different gradients, just like anything else does. But I don't like to use the word slum because the slums in Kenya aren't even the same scale as the slums in India or anything. They're all different gradients. South Africa, I mean, every place has its different levels of poverty. And even within the same country, it's like this. But Barry Manilow, when he talks about Copacabana, there's favelas in Copacabana, but they don't want you to see that association. So that's what there was going on the World Cup. Because Brazil had to sell an image to the world that, hey, we may be poor, but we're not going to show you how poor we are. It's kind of like how they do with the White House. They pan into the White House. You always see the White House, but you never see what's behind the White House, which is very close to the black neighborhoods in DC. But you don't see that. All you see is just a pan in of the White House. You don't see what's around it. Like they don't ever see. Next time when you think about DC, see if they show you a picture of anything besides the White House. Like if you do a Google search or anything, and you kind of see the point I'm making. Um, you want people to concentrate on one thing, and that's what this racial democracy myth does. The point is to hide all the racism in the background, kind of like the "This Is America," the Childish Gambino video, where he's dancing and everything is distracting you in the back, but there's also there's killings going on in the back, but you're so distracted by the dancing and stuff and the movement. You're like, okay, what is this about? This is America. He's singing, dancing, or whatever, but it's really serious stuff in the background that's hidden. And so the democracy myth does this a lot too. The whole idea of hiding the images, just as much as it does projecting the images and expanding on the images. Um, So let's go back. I'm trying to think. Do I need to show you all anything? No, no, I don't need to show you all anything. Um, the myth. So yeah, you have this. They basically wanted to pay Google to take favela off of the maps, which is a way of hiding the people in a way. Um, and it's all these places do this. It's a very common case of brochuring is what I like to call it, selling the images to people. But the myth, I guess, I don't know if y'all have kind of understood more or less what I've tried to explain so far, but you see it more in the textual analysis of Sortilegio Dois, which is the theater piece. And I meant to show y'all something else too about the Afro cosmology, but we can go back to that in a second. The myth is really prevalent in Sortilegio Dois. If you analyze the characters, you have Dr. Emmanuel, which is a black man. Dr. Emmanuel is a black man. You have Margarita, his white wife. Um, Iphigenia is his ex-girlfriend, black woman. And you have the dynamic right there already. You have the black man, you have black woman, then you black woman is basically like the side woman, and his wife Margarita, who he really doesn't. He's not even attracted to her physically, but it's the indoctrination into his mind. He feels because of his status that he has to be with someone white because he's a doctor, he's a lawyer, so he has to find someone that matches his status. But the crazy thing about it is that Margarita really didn't have status. So the point being made is that her whiteness alone was the status. And so him as a black man, he has to quote unquote marry up. This is the thing, especially in Latin America, to a lesser extent in the United States, but it's a dynamic too. The whole idea of marrying up, the caste system that's present, the black person or the darker person being viewed as someone of the lower caste, and the white person being part of the upper caste. But we know that it's not that simple because they're poor whites as well. But it goes into the whole um, this indoctrination of the person with Dr. Emmanuel and Frantz Fanon, who was a philosopher, a thinker, a Martinican thinker. He talks about this inferiority complex of blacks in the Americas, and you see it in Dr. Emmanuel in Sortilégio Dois. Um, so, long story short, Emmanuel marries Margarita, even though um, he goes through so much being with her. Like they go through a lot, honestly, together because um, she ends up killing their kid, the kid that they were supposed to have. Like she ends up aborting her own kid because her mom, who's a present, she's like not that big of a character, but a few of her lines are just they show you how indicative the racism is in Brazil. She's basically like, don't marry this dark bastard, this black dude, don't marry him. I don't give a damn if he's a doctor or not, don't marry him. And yeah, keep in mind this is a theater piece. And but remember, Abdias do Nascimento, when he's writing this, he's trying to explain to you how this is not a racial democracy. Like, how is it a racial democracy when you have a white woman killing her own kid, when you have a doctor that's getting beat down by the police like routinely, police brutality. This is happening during the dictatorship too. Like in reality, this is during a military dictatorship. So it's touching on things outside of the theater piece itself, but it's also reflective of the society at the time, and also now even in 2024, police brutality is a serious problem in Brazil. It's not just a U.S. thing towards Black people. Um, it happens to everyone in the country, but disproportionately, it happens a lot to blacks in Brazil too. And so this is talked about a lot. The paddy wagon scene where he's beat down as a student. Maybe he was protesting something or what, but um, there's a point where Margarita, I think, is with him, and the police basically pull him out of the car. They beat him down, and his wife is there. I think at the time maybe she's his girlfriend, but there's nothing she can do. She's sitting there, she's basically a witness to the brutality, and that's kind of the point of the theater piece. Though is like, look at all these observers and look at the victims, and society's kind of just like carrying on, like okay, whatever. And in this case, Margarita with her man, she's just what are the cops going to do? She says something. The cops are not even paying attention to her. They're still beating up her future husband. And so you have this going on. How is it possible that this guy is getting beat down like this all the time? He's a doctor though, right? That's not supposed to happen to someone prominent with the title. But it just goes to show you that um being black, in Brazil, And this is what Jesus was saying in the piece. You being from a higher socioeconomic status doesn't make you exempt to the racism, to the beatings. You can't escape this. And you have that going on, debunking the myth. You also have, what else do you have going on? You have a lot of the Afro cosmology. The spirituality is really important. It's referred to as Macumba. Macumba is actually a bunch of different Afro religious systems, Afro cosmological systems in Brazil. Um, Candomblé, Umbanda. In Cuba, you have Santeria, which is Lucumi, Regla de Ocha. Um, and then you have Palo Mayombe. You have all these Vodou in Haiti, Voodoo. You have all these different systems. They come from Ifa, and that's when we have Baba Awo. He's going to come on next week to discuss this more. And I actually work with Awo, and we will talk about that during the episode. But Ifa is this larger belief system, and Macumba comes from that system. But it's Macumba is a term that's used in Sortilegio, but it's colloquial. It's derogatory, really. The way it's used in the novel or in the theater piece, because it's basically black magic, sorcery, sortilegio. Um, so it's kind of the whole idea of black magic, but it's deeper than that. When when you're looking for the actual culture that we had before the transatlantic slave trade, this is the recuperation of the memory. This is our culture, the Yoruba culture. A lot of the slaves come from the Yoruba culture, and they brought these traditions and cosmologies over with them, orishas. I'm going to show you exactly what this is visually. Let me share my screen. Sorry if I'm rambling. This is very hard to do on the fly. But I think people will get something out of this too. So you go right here. Let's just use something here, for instance, because again, it's all really part of the same family. Candomblé, it's from the Yoruba culture. Santeria is as well, even though it's Cuba specific. Candomblé, Brazil, but they practice Santeria in Venezuela too. Like I shouldn't have said that, but it's very common in Cuba. It's more associated with Cuba. Let's do a slideshow here. So these are orishas, and these are like deities in this Yoruba cosmology. Is called Ifa, but in different places in Latin America, it may be called something else. Candomblé in Brazil is part of this larger system. Voodoo, I know you've heard of that before, that term voodoo in Haiti. Um, this is all part of that system. This is our ancestry, but it's mocked a lot of times in U.S. culture and Latin American culture. In Hollywood, Hollywood does a good job of just mocking our ancestry, honestly. Like blacks in the United States are very guilty of this, like mocking voodoo basically when it's like part of our culture. This is a larger cosmological, spiritual basis. And I'm an atheist personally, but I teach this to my kids. I teach this to my students, and it's important to debunk this racism. And honestly, it's part of the racial democracy myth because the racial democracy likes to diminish this stuff or its importance, the Afro spirituality component to society in Brazil, especially when we talk about Brazil. Brazil was the last country to abolish slavery in the Americas, 1888. And so a lot of people have the Princess Isabella context. They have this complex, the Princess Isabella complex. Slavery ended in 1888. everything's good, but not really. The transition continues today. You could easily make that argument. The disparities are still being felt from slavery. Um, Cuba, 1886, slavery was abolished. In Puerto Rico, 1873. So you have all these different dynamics going on. But let's stick to the cosmology component. You have these different orishas, um, and the supreme uh, Olodumare, which really doesn't have a gender, is like the supreme being. I don't want to compare everything to Christianity or anything, but this would be, there's really not a comparison because Olodumare is, that would be the supreme being, what we would refer to, I guess, as God, Olofi, as well in Christianity. So these are orishas, these are deities that are part of this pantheon of Yoruba culture, which is transported to Latin America and Brazil, Candomblé. This is what's being used in um, the piece, the Sortilegio Dois, Alegua. These are all orishas. Eshu is really featured more so in Sortilegio Dois with Emmanuel, the protagonist. Um, Ogun, Oya, Ashoshi, Olokun. Olokun, these orishas a lot of times have feminine and masculine characteristics. Sometimes they're androgynous. Olokun is an androgynous orisha. So this is very different from Christianity, just to use it as an example. The whole idea of Satan versus God, good versus evil. You don't have this in Ifa. You don't have this in Santeria, in Candomblé. These extremes like heaven and hell. There's no heaven and hell, like none of that stuff. Um, and that's why it's mimicked a lot, or not mimicked, but mocked a lot and like degraded upon in the mainstream media, Hollywood, and blacks have felt victim to this, mocking our own spiritual system, and when it's really supposed to be something that it should be a source of pride. Honestly, I know it's prideful me teaching this stuff to the students because at one point I wasn't sure how people were going to take this in, if I taught these types of subjects. But I've gotten to the point now where I don't give a damn anymore. I'm going to teach what I want to teach, and I'm teaching this to you all today, or at least just introducing it to people who may not be accustomed to it. But this is all part of our this spiritual system, this Candomblé system, Yamaya, Oshun. These are all major figures. We're going to talk about this next week, though, more so. Babalu Aye. Um, and it'll be easier when we actually talk to a real person that understands this more, and we can make a better conversation with it. But that just gives you an idea of what we're talking about as far as the presence of Afro spirituality in the theater piece. Um, Miscegenation, the whole idea of race mixing, you have this in Sortilegio. So you have the binaries going on, and Dr. Emmanuel, he kills his wife. So do you see what I mean about just completely dismantling this whole idea of the harmonious races getting along? Um, you have Margarita killing her own kid, the unborn child, and again, this has nothing to do with like making an argument for or against abortion, but simply saying that abortion, in this case, is a larger reflection of Brazilian society and how this the racial genocide component, not just a racial genocide component, like trying to kill away the blackness, but it's also a cultural genocide that Abdias refers to himself in a lot of his philosophies, a lot of his writings and his pamphlets and his essays, he explains this whole idea of a racial genocide. Thomas Skidmore alludes to this some too, but Abdias do Nascimento is really known for this, the whole idea of the racial genocide in Brazil. This still goes on today, but he also understood the importance of the spiritual component and the exploitation of that spiritual component a lot of times from other sources. So you have that tension. You have a person, Dr. Emmanuel, he's trying to find himself, the return to Zumbi. He wants to return back to the motherland. He wants to return back to his ancestry, Zumbi dos Palmares. Zumbi was the last king of Palmares, which was a quilombo. We talked about that earlier, the runaway settlement communities. So Zumbi is based on a real person, but in the fictional theater piece, Zumbi means basically like it's a metamorphosis. Emmanuel wants to go back to um, a more pure form, a more raw form, a more authentic self. But it's a self that's always it's always in flux. It's always moving, kind of like the whole idea of cimarronajes, the cimarron, the runaway. You just can't stay in one place. You have to keep searching for something. So the whole idea of motion within the theater piece is present. The whole idea of the place, the non-place, the place that's not a place, the place that one is trying to search for. I think Emmanuel is trying to search for that place, the motherland, the inner motherland, you know, because Africa is a distant place in these fictional novels and theater pieces. You get the Helena Herrera, the Cuban poet, when she used to write, Africa is viewed as a distant place, but it's also a very personal, sentimental place to these subjects and these protagonists and characters. So this is not an exception. Um, we talked about what the genocide, the whole idea of Black genocide. So Margarita poisons a kid, kills her kid, unborn child. Um, as retaliation, Emmanuel kills her, and then he gives back with Ephigenia, the Black woman. At the end, again, it raises up a lot of questions about Margarita. It raises up a lot of questions about Emmanuel because you say to yourself, a racial democracy, but yet she kills her own kid and he kills her as a result of that. It shows you the tension. And then even during the wedding ceremony, Margarita's mom is calling Emmanuel names like don't marry this black bastard, don't marry him. I mean, it shows you the tension that's there. So even under the portrayal of the racial democracy, you know it's bullshit just from that standpoint alone. Because if you just remove one layer, you're like, there's tension there. You see the tension. It's not as easy as saying, oh, look at all these people getting along. Society's not getting along like they're making it seem. Um, and also in Brazil, it's no different than any other place. Only 1% of relationships or marriages are within the people of the same racial category. So it means that people are pretty much, I don't want to call it self-preservation, but people are basically with people that look like them. Brazil's no exception to this. I mean, any other country. And so that goes into the whole idea of debunking the myth. I mean, people are doing what they want to do, at the end of the day. Um, Racism is very much alive in Brazil. You see a lot of the maids are black and they serve middle class, upper class white people in Brazil. A lot of the indigenous women that marry Indian women do this as well. They have servant work basically. They upkeep the homes And a lot of times it's in these big homes, these rich white households in Brazil. But again, it's a racial democracy. And I don't want to generalize too much. But this is common in Brazil. It is. As recent as the 90s, there's a town called Visalia, and France Windance Twine, who's a sociologist based in the U.S., but she does a lot of Brazil work and U.S. intersectional stuff. She had a piece called "Racism in a Racial Democracy," and really important work. I think it's written in 1996, based on her experiences as a Black woman, indigenous woman in the United States, going down to Brazil to see how she's perceived as a lighter skinned Black person in Brazil in this town called Visalia, and just the inequities that were just there. People walking on the different side of the sidewalk because they were a different race. Basically, de facto, like Jim Crow type stuff happening in this community where they still had segregated spaces. Um, so that's what I mean about debunking the myth. I use that in this particular chapter. Um, I want to really talk more about the spirituality component of this. Filias do Santo, I didn't even mention them as a very important character in the theater piece. They're basically like the feminine voice of a cohesive feminine voice. But they're also characters themselves, but they're witnessing. They're witnesses and they're also characters, but they're metafictional because they're commenting on something that they're in, if that makes sense. So the Filias do Santo, a lot of times, it's like in theater, when they pan out and talk to the crowd, like the characters will actually talk to the crowd, it's kind of like that dynamic where the Filias do Santo are like taking breaks and addressing the audience directly. In this case, you would be the audience, the person who's reading the theater piece, versus being there live at a theater or auditorium. And the Filias do Santo or the Ilha Lurisha are part of this Afro-cosmology that system that I've talked about, Candomblé, but they refer to it as Macumba in Sortilegio Dois. They basically make Emmanuel question his like his decisions. Like, are you sure you want to be with this woman? Like, she doesn't even love you like that. She may just have a sexual attraction to you. But other than that, I mean, she's not even into you like that. And then on the other hand, he's not even physically attracted to Margarita. It's simply a status thing to him, which goes back to the Frantz Fanon, the inferiority complex that inflicts itself on Black people, especially Black men, when we talk about interracial components, relationships, marriages. There's a lot of research that's been done into this. And it's a psychological thing because Frantz Fanon, this Martinican theorist, he was a psychiatrist. So he had this the whole idea of neurosis, the racial neurosis. You see it with Emmanuel, um, basically degrading at first. He grows up Catholic and he's degrading the Macumba protection, the practitioners of Macumba, this black magic as he calls it, which is really the ancestral cosmology system that I showed you earlier, the Orishas. Again, we're going to have a whole episode dedicated to this next week. But the Filias do Santo are basically like a consciousness for Emmanuel. And they highlight like the whole idea of going back to the motherland. And at the end, Emmanuel discovers this motherland, this this place that he's trying to find. Um, goes on the mountain, on the temple. There's a beautiful ceremony at the end, and then he's there with Evgenia. But I have to do another episode to analyze the characters that I don't do on this one. And I think before I came out with an official pod, I had to do this on older videos. You can find them on Facebook still, where I had to do 2 or 3 videos to break down this theater piece because there's just so much there. But it goes the whole piece debunks this whole idea of racial harmony. That's the best way to put it. Um, I hope this episode turned out somewhat informative. It didn't turn out as good as I wanted it to. I mean, it's just a lot going on. I mean, I haven't had much sleep. I'm actually going to go to sleep pretty soon. But this is a episode 92, and I hope you got some out of it. And the next few episodes are definitely going to be with guests. I may do one by myself in a few weeks, but we're going to have a group of amazing guests coming down the road. I encourage all my audience to subscribe to Kiko's Free Thinkers Forum for free on YouTube exclusively. Tell your friends and family about us. You can't unthink free thought. Just expand your time a little bit. Use a little bit of your time. That's all I'm looking for from you as an audience person. I don't need your money. I just need you to dedicate a little bit of your time and your mind to maybe expanding it some and having some free thought, searching for that free thought that you may not have known that you had. And tell everyone else to do the same thing. Subscribe to this YouTube channel, support independent media and minds. If you look at the plethora of people we've had, the versatility of the guests, and the thought process, that's what we want to do is just make people question things more, think about, the ramifications of some of these things. A lot I want to talk about today. I really didn't get to do it. But again, this is meant to be just a general episode about what I'm expanding on as far as my future plans to write a book. This was part of chapter 3 of my dissertation. Um, and I hope you all got some out of this. Didn't turn out as good as I wanted it to, but hey, that's all I can do today as far as giving you information. Enjoy your day, beautiful people, and we will talk soon. Signing off. Cheers.